Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change your life forever. Mason Clarke learned this truth on a frozen night when he had almost nothing left to lose. At 51, he was living in a shelter with his son, picking up day labor when he could find it, just trying to keep going. That December evening, he stopped to help a stranded stranger fix a flat tire in the snow. The well-dressed older man thanked him and drove off into the night. Mason thought that was the end of it, but the next morning, a black Rolls-Royce pulled up outside the shelter with an envelope that had his name on it. What was inside that letter? And how did one simple act of decency lead to the second chance Mason never saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Men's Shelter sat on the eastern edge of the city, where the industrial warehouses gave way to empty lots and chain-link fences. It was a low-slung brick building that had once been a community center, back when this neighborhood still had communities. Now it housed 43 men on any given night, their belongings stuffed into plastic bins, their dignity measured in the space of a narrow cot. Mason Clarke had been living there for 8 months. He woke every morning at 5:30, before the overhead lights flickered on and the day shift supervisor made his rounds. In those quiet pre-dawn moments, Mason would sit on the edge of his cot and pull on his work boots, scuffed leather Red Wings that had outlasted 2 jobs and 1 marriage. He'd lace them slowly, methodically, the way his father had taught him. There was a right way to do things, even small things, especially small things. His son Drew slept in the cot beside him, one arm flung over his face to block out the emergency exit light that never quite dimmed. At 24, Drew was lean and restless, with his mother's dark hair and his father's cautious eyes. He'd come back 6 months ago, showing up at the shelter's intake desk with a duffel bag, and an apology Mason had waited 3 years to hear. "They're running a shuttle to the industrial park at 6, Mason said quietly, nudging his son's shoulder. "You coming?" Drew groaned and rolled toward the wall. "Got that thing at the temp agency at 9. Said I'd be there early." "You will be. Day labor ends at 8. Dad, 4 hours is 4 hours. $50 is $50. Drew sat up, rubbing his face. He looked older than 24 sometimes, particularly in this light, in this place. "Yeah, okay. Give me 5 minutes." They moved through their morning routine with practiced efficiency. The bathroom at the end of the hall, where Mason washed his face and hands with the generic soap from the wall dispenser. The common room, where they grabbed coffee from the large metal urn that Bernard Hutchins, the shelter director, kept perpetually brewing. The side door that led to the parking lot, where the white passenger van idled in the cold. Bernard stood by the van, checking names on his clipboard. He was a compact man in his 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a cord around his neck. He'd run Riverside for 12 years, and he knew every man by name, by story, by the particular shape of his struggles. "Mason, Drew?" He nodded at them both. "Warehouse work today. Unloading freight. They're asking for 8 guys. We'll take it," Mason said. Bernard's eyes crinkled with something that might have been approval, or might have been sadness. "You always do." The van filled up quickly. Mason recognized most of the faces. Carlos, who'd lost his restaurant job when his work permit expired. Eugene, a veteran with a bad back and worse dreams. Young Terry, barely 20, who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. They were all good men, or had been once, or were trying to be again. The world had simply stopped making space for them. The work was exactly what Bernard had promised. 4 hours of hauling boxes off trucks in an unheated warehouse, while a supervisor with a headset barked instructions. Mason's back ached by the second hour, a deep throb that settled into his lower spine and radiated up between his shoulder blades. He was 51 years old. His body remembered when this kind of work had been easy. Drew worked beside him, moving faster but less efficiently, burning energy he'd need later. Mason wanted to tell him to pace himself, but he learned that some lessons only stuck when you figured them out on your own. By 8 o'clock, they'd earned their $50 each. Cash, paid out by a woman at a card table near the loading dock. Mason folded his bills carefully and tucked them into his front pocket, where he could feel them against his leg. Back at the shelter, Drew showered and changed for his appointment. Mason sat in the common room with his coffee, watching the morning news on the wall-mounted television. His segment about the holiday season, shopping, families gathering, the cheerful unreality of it all. "You eaten?" Bernard dropped into the chair beside him. "I'm good." "That's not what I asked." Mason smiled despite himself. "I'll grab something at lunch. There's bagels in the kitchen. Donated from that place on 7th Street. Still fresh. I'll get one in a bit." Bernard was quiet for a moment, watching the television without really seeing it. "How's Drew doing?" "Better. He's trying. And you?" "Same as yesterday. That's what worries me." Bernard turned to look at him directly. "You've been here 8 months, Mason. You show up for every work call, you help the other guys, you keep your head down. But you're still here. Where else would I be? Somewhere with a future. You're smart, you're capable, you're—" Bernard paused, searching for the word. "You're better than this place." Mason took a long sip of his coffee. It had gone lukewarm. "No such thing as better. Just different circumstances. That's resignation talking." "That's experience." Bernard shook his head but didn't argue. He stood, touched Mason's shoulder briefly, and walked back toward his office. Mason sat alone watching the television, not really watching it at all. He thought about his life before this. The construction job he'd held for 15 years, framing houses in the suburbs. Good money, union benefits, a future that felt solid. Then the recession hit, and the housing market collapsed, and the company folded in 3 months. He'd thought it would be temporary. He'd thought his wife Sheila would understand, would wait it out with him. She'd lasted 6 weeks before she filed for divorce. Drew had been 14 then. Old enough to see everything, young enough to blame himself. He'd bounced between Mason's tiny apartment and Sheila's new place across town, growing quieter and angrier with each passing month. By 17, he'd stopped coming around at all. By 20, he was gone completely, crashed on friends' couches, worked under-the-table jobs, disappeared for months at a time. When he showed up at Riverside last spring, Mason had barely recognized him. Thinner, harder, with a wariness in his eyes that looked like a mirror. "I messed up, Dad," Drew had said, standing in the intake area with his duffel bag. "I don't have anywhere else." Mason had signed the paperwork to add him as a resident without hesitation. Now they were here together, trying to build something from nothing, trying to remember how to be father and son instead of 2 men who happened to share blood and bad luck. Drew came back from his appointment just after noon, his face carefully neutral. "How'd it go?" Mason asked. "They'll call if something comes up." Drew's voice carried the flat tone of disappointment dressed up as optimism. "Something will." "Yeah." Drew didn't sound convinced. They ate lunch from the shelter kitchen, donated sandwiches and fruit cups, and then Mason announced he needed to take a walk. The walls felt close sometimes, the recycled air and constant proximity of 40 other lives. Drew nodded, pulled out his phone to scroll through job listings. Outside, the December air bit through Mason's jacket. The sky hung low and grey, promising snow before nightfall. He walked without particular direction, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his worn work gloves stiff with cold. His route took him past the businesses that had survived this neighborhood's decline. A coin laundry, a check-cashing place, a bodega with bars on the windows. Past the empty lots where buildings had been torn down and never replaced. Past the elementary school where he used to drop Drew off on his way to job sites, back when dropping your kid at school was just part of the routine and not a memory that hurt. He turned onto Riverside Avenue, following it west toward the nicer parts of town. He did this sometimes, walked the borderline between where he lived and where he used to belong. Not out of bitterness, exactly. More like maintaining a connection to the idea that circumstances could change. The snow started just after 3 o'clock, fat flakes that caught in his hair and melted on his shoulders. Mason turned back toward the shelter, retracing his steps through the gathering dusk. The streetlights flickered on, halogen orange against the darkening sky. That's when he saw the car. It was a luxury sedan, sleek and black, pulled halfway onto the shoulder of Riverside Avenue with its hazard lights blinking rhythmically in the snowy dusk. The kind of car Mason saw sometimes in the financial district downtown, always moving, always gleaming, always belonging to someone whose problems didn't include where they'd sleep that night. This one sat motionless, incongruous against the backdrop of shuttered storefronts and cracked pavement. Mason slowed his pace. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a figure standing beside the car, a man in a long, dark coat, holding a cell phone to his ear. Even from a distance, everything about his posture suggested frustration and unfamiliarity with his current circumstances. Mason's first instinct was to keep walking. Getting involved in other people's problems had rarely improved his own situation. But something made him stop. Maybe the way the man kept looking down at the flat rear tire, then back at his phone, as if the right combination of staring and calling might solve the problem through sheer force of will. "You need help?" Mason called out. The man turned, lowering his phone. He was older than Mason had first thought, somewhere in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested boardrooms and country clubs. His coat probably cost more than Mason used to make in a month. The man glanced at the tire again. "Yes, actually. I seem to have a flat, and my roadside assistant says it'll be at least 90 minutes in this weather." Mason walked closer, snow crunching under his boots. "You have a spare?" "I assume so. I've never actually—" The man paused, something like embarrassment crossing his features. "I've never changed a tire." Mason nodded slowly. Of course he hadn't. Men like this didn't change their own tires. They had people for that, services, solutions that arrived with a phone call. "Pop the trunk," Mason said. "Let's see what you've got." The man pressed his key fob, and the trunk opened with a smooth hydraulic hiss. Inside, everything was pristine, carpeted, organized, with the spare tire secured beneath a fitted cover. Mason pulled it out, along with the jack and lug wrench, his movements automatic. He'd changed hundreds of tires over the years, on job sites and in driveways, and once on the side of the interstate with Sheila crying in the passenger seat because they were late to her sister's wedding. "I'm Everett," the man said, watching Mason work. "Everett Langston." Mason Clarke. He positioned the jack under the car's frame, his fingers already numb from the cold. "I appreciate this, truly. Should I pay you something?" Mason cranked the jack, lifting the car inch by careful inch. "Let's just get you back on the road." They didn't talk much after that. Everett stood a respectful distance away, occasionally offering to help in ways that made it clear he had no idea what helping would look like. Mason worked methodically, loosening the lug nuts, removing the flat tire, mounting the spare. His back complained and his knees protested against the cold pavement, but his hands knew what to do. The snow fell harder, accumulating on Mason's shoulders and in the treads of the damaged tire. His work gloves, stained and patched with one thumb splitting at the seam, grew dark with moisture. But the work felt good in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Competence felt good. Being useful felt good. When he'd tightened the last lug nut and lowered the jack, Mason stood slowly, feeling every one of his 51 years in his lower back. "There you go," he said, loading the flat tire and tools back into the trunk. "You'll want to get that patched or replaced soon. The spare's just temporary." Everett looked at the car, then at Mason, something unreadable in his expression. "Thank you, really, He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. "You don't need to do that," Mason said. "Please, for your time. It was 20 minutes, and honestly, I'm glad I could help." Mason brushed snow from his hair. "Just pay it forward sometime." Everett hesitated, then pulled a folded bill from his wallet and pressed it into Mason's gloved hand before Mason could refuse. "At least let me cover your coffee. You must be freezing." Mason looked down at his hand. Even through the damp glove, he could feel it was a 20. Too much for coffee, not enough to argue about in the snow. "Thanks," he said simply. Everett extended his hand and Mason shook it, his own hand cold and rough, Everett's warm and smooth. Two men from completely different worlds, briefly intersecting on a snowy evening on Riverside Avenue. "Drive safe," Mason said. "You too." "And thank you again." Mason Clarke. Mason watched the sedan pull away, its taillights disappearing into the white curtain of snow. Then he turned and continued his walk back to the shelter, the $20 bill tucked into his pocket alongside his day labor earnings. By the time he arrived, his jacket was soaked through and his teeth were chattering. Drew looked up from his phone as Mason came through the door, concern flickering across his face. "Where were you? You've been gone for hours, just walking. Helped a guy with a flat tire. In this?" Drew gestured toward the window, where snow was now coming down in sheets. Mason shrugged. "Wrong place, right time. Or right place, right time. However that saying goes." In the common room, a dozen men sat watching television or playing cards. Mason bought 3 cups of coffee from the vending machine with the $20 bill. One for himself. One for Drew, one for Eugene, who was having one of his bad nights and sat alone in the corner. "Staring at nothing. You didn't have to do that," Eugene said when Mason handed him the cup. "I know." That night, Mason lay in his cot, listening to the symphony of the shelter, coughs and snores, someone's whispered phone conversation, the rattle of old pipes in the walls. He thought about the man in the expensive coat, about the gulf between their lives, about how strange it was that their paths had crossed at all. He thought about the $20 he'd spent on coffee for men who had even less than he did. He thought about Drew, sleeping fitfully in the next cot, and about the temp agency that probably wouldn't call, and about how many more days and weeks and months they might be living like this. Then he stopped thinking and tried to sleep, because tomorrow would come regardless, and it would require whatever strength he could muster. The next morning arrived cold and bright, the storm having passed through overnight. Mason woke at his usual time, went through his usual routine. Drew had an appointment with another employment agency at 10, so they skipped the day labor shuttle. At 9:30, Mason was sitting in the common room with his second cup of coffee when Bernard appeared in the doorway, his face carrying an odd expression. "Mason, there's someone here to see you." "Who?" "Come see for yourself." Mason followed Bernard to the front entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see it. A black Rolls-Royce parked directly in front of the shelter, impossible and gleaming and utterly out of place. A man in a dark suit stood beside it, scanning the building's facade. "He's asking for you by name," Bernard said quietly. "Says he has a delivery." Mason pushed through the doors into the sharp morning air. The driver turned, holding a cream-colored envelope. "Mason Clarke." "That's me. This is for you, sir." The driver handed him the envelope, nodded politely, and returned to the Rolls-Royce. A moment later, the car glided away, leaving Mason standing on the sidewalk with the envelope in his hands. It was heavy paper, expensive, with his name written across the front in elegant script. In the upper left corner, raised letters spelled out Langston Foundation. Mason's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside was a letter, typewritten on matching stationery, and a business card. Mason read the letter once, quickly, not quite believing the words. Then he read it again, slowly. "Dear Mr. Clarke, last evening you stopped to help a stranger without hesitation or expectation of reward. In that simple act, you demonstrated the kind of character that is increasingly rare. Competence paired with genuine compassion. Dignity without pretense. I would like to offer you a position with the Langston Foundation as a community liaison. This is not charity, but a genuine opportunity based on qualifications I believe you possess: an understanding of hardship, an ability to assess authentic need, and an unshakable sense of integrity. If this interests you, please call me at the number on the enclosed card. I'd like to discuss the details in person." Respectfully, Everett Langston Mason stood there for a long moment, the letter trembling in his hands, while Bernard waited silently beside him. Behind them, through the glass doors, he could see Drew watching from inside. "Mason," Bernard said finally. "You okay?" Mason folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. His throat felt tight, and his eyes burned in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, I think I might be." Mason didn't sleep that night. He lay in his cot, listening to the familiar sounds of the shelter, turning the business card over and over in his hands. In the darkness, he couldn't read the embossed lettering, but his fingers had already memorized its shape, the weight of quality cardstock, the subtle texture of expensive printing. Everett Langston, private number. Call any time, simple, elegant, and utterly terrifying. Mason had spent the afternoon in the shelter's small chapel room, really just a converted storage space with a few chairs and a cross on the wall, reading and rereading the letter until he could recite it from memory. Drew had found him there around dinner time. "Is it real?" Drew had asked, dropping into the chair beside him. "I think so. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." But that wasn't quite true. Mason knew what he should do, what any rational person would do. Call the number, take the meeting, accept whatever opportunity was being offered. The problem was that rationality required a kind of hope Mason had learned to live without. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant vulnerability. Hope meant the possibility of disappointment sharp enough to cut. Beside him now, Drew stirred in his sleep, murmuring something incomprehensible. Mason thought about all the ways he'd failed his son, the lost job, the divorce, the years of instability. The fact that they were here, in this place, together. What if this job offer was real, and he somehow messed it up? What if it wasn't real at all, just some wealthy man's fleeting impulse that would evaporate under scrutiny? What if he called, and Everett Langston didn't even remember who he was? At 5:30, Mason gave up on sleep. He sat on the edge of his cot, pulled on his boots, and went to the common room. The coffee wasn't ready yet, so he stood at the window, watching the city wake up beyond the chain-link fence. Drew found him there an hour later. "You didn't go out for day labor. Didn't feel like it?" "Dad." Drew stood beside him at the window. "You have to call him." "I know, so why haven't you?" Mason was quiet for a long time. "What if it's not what I think it is? What if he's just offering me janitorial work or, I don't know, something I could get anywhere? Then it's still a job. With benefits, probably. An actual paycheck." Drew paused. "But you don't think that's what it is?" "No." "Then what are you afraid of?" Mason looked at his son, 24 years old, trying so hard to put his life back together, looking to his father for some kind of example worth following. "I'm afraid of hoping," Mason said simply. Drew nodded slowly, like he understood. Maybe he did. Hope's scary. But you know what's scarier? Spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd just made the call. At 9 o'clock, Mason walked to the corner store 3 blocks away. He bought a cheap phone card with some of his day labor money and used the payphone outside, one of the few still functioning in the city. His hands shook as he dialed. The phone rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. "Everett Langston." "Mr. Langston? This is Mason Clarke. From the other night, with the tire." "Mason, I'm glad you called." No hesitation, no confusion. Everett remembered him perfectly. "Did you receive my letter?" "Yes, sir." "Yesterday morning. And are you interested?" Mason closed his eyes. "I am. But I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're offering." "That's fair. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Would you be available to meet this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? "Yes, where?" Everett gave him an address in the financial district downtown. "Take the elevator to the 42nd floor. Give them your name at the reception desk." "I'll see you at 2. After hanging up, Mason stood at the payphone for several minutes, his heart pounding. Then he walked back to the shelter, his mind racing through everything he needed to do in the next 5 hours. Bernard helped him without asking questions. He found Mason a clean white button-down shirt from the donation closet, still in its packaging, probably meant for someone's job interview. Drew pressed it carefully, using the iron in the common room, his movements deliberate and focused. "You need a haircut," Drew said, studying his father critically. "Can't afford a decent one. There's that place on 4th Street. Does cuts for $12. Mason pulled out his remaining day labor cash and counted it. $38. "I'll need money for the bus downtown. I've got $7, Drew said. "That's enough for the bus, round trip." At 11:30, Mason walked to the discount barber on 4th Street. The barber was an older man who worked quickly and efficiently. asking no questions about where Mason came from or where he was going. When he finished, Mason looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Cleaned up, presentable, almost respectable. Back at the shelter, he changed into the pressed shirt and his least worn pair of jeans. Drew helped him tie his one necktie, a navy blue one Mason had kept from his construction days when he'd occasionally had to meet with architects or building inspectors. "You look good, Dad," Drew said quietly. Professional. At 1 o'clock, Mason caught the bus downtown. He sat in the back, watching the city transform through the windows as they moved from the industrial edges toward the gleaming center. The buildings grew taller, the streets cleaner, the people better dressed. He'd worked in these neighborhoods once, building the condos and office complexes that now housed people whose lives looked nothing like his. The irony wasn't lost on him. The address Everett had given him was a glass and steel tower that seemed to scrape the winter sky. Mason stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, staring up at it, before forcing himself through the revolving doors. The lobby was all marble and modern art, with a security desk and turnstiles that required key cards. Mason approached the reception desk, acutely aware of how his discount haircut and second-hand shirt must look in this space. "I have an appointment with Everett Langston," he said. "Mason Clarke, 2 o'clock. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect hair and a practiced smile, checked her computer. "Of course, Mr. Clarke. Take elevator bank C to the 42nd floor. Mr. Langston's assistant will meet you there." She handed him a visitor's badge and gestured toward the elevators. Mason clipped it to his shirt and walked across the lobby, feeling like an imposter in someone else's life. The elevator was empty except for him. He watched the floor numbers climb, 20, 30, 40, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. The doors opened onto a reception area that was somehow both understated and obviously expensive. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, artwork that looked real rather than rented. A woman in her 40s sat behind a modern desk, and she smiled warmly as Mason approached. "Mr. Clarke, I'm Iris Pemberton, Mr. Langston's assistant. He's expecting you." She stood and gestured toward a hallway. "Right this way." Mason followed her past several closed doors to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Everett Langston stood at one of those windows, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. "Mr. Clarke is here," Iris said. Everett turned, and his face broke into a genuine smile. He crossed the office with his hand extended. "Mason, thank you for coming." They shook hands, and Everett gestured to a pair of leather chairs near the window. "Please sit. Can Iris get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." Everett sat across from him, his posture relaxed but attentive. "I imagine you have questions." "A few," Mason admitted. "Starting with why you'd offer me a job based on changing your tire." Everett nodded, as if he'd expected this. "That's a fair question." "The honest answer is that I wasn't offering you a job based on changing my tire. I was offering you a job based on how you changed my tire." Mason waited. "You didn't hesitate," Everett continued. "You didn't ask for anything in return. You were competent, efficient, and kind. And when I tried to pay you, you refused, even though I could see from your gloves and your jacket that you probably needed the money. You gave me $20 anyway, for coffee. Not for the work." Everett leaned forward slightly. "Mason, I've built a career on assessing people, reading character, identifying potential, and I saw something in you that night, something I've been looking for." Everett stood and walked to his desk, returning with a leather folder. He handed it to Mason, who opened it carefully. Inside were architectural drawings, blueprints for a residential complex, detailed and professional. "This is the Langston Foundation's current project," Everett said. "Transitional housing for working families. Not shelters, not handouts. Actual apartments with job training, financial counseling, childcare support. A bridge between crisis and stability." Mason studied the drawings. 50 units, community spaces, a courtyard. It was ambitious and thoughtful, designed with dignity in mind. "We break ground in the spring," Everett continued. "But construction is the easy part. The hard part is finding the right families, people who genuinely need help but will use it to build something lasting, people who won't abuse the system but won't be broken by it either." And you think I can identify those people? I think you've lived it. You understand the difference between someone who's temporarily down and someone who's given up. Between pride that's destructive and dignity that's worth preserving. Everett paused. I need someone who can interview applicants with empathy and skepticism in equal measure. Someone those families will trust because he's been where they are. Mason closed the folder slowly. What would the job actually involve? Initially, helping us develop the screening process, interviewing applicant families, assessing their situations, making recommendations. As the project grows, and it will grow, your role would expand. Training others, overseeing multiple sites, shaping how we approach this work. Everett named a salary that made Mason's breath catch. Full benefits, health insurance, retirement contributions. And we'd need you to start immediately, which means we'd help with housing during the transition period. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Mason gripped the arms of his chair. That's more than generous. It's fair compensation for important work, Everett corrected gently. This isn't charity, Mason. I'm offering you this job because I believe you're the right person for it. But I need to know you believe it too. Mason looked out the window at the city spread below them. Somewhere out there, beyond the gleaming towers, was the riverside shelter. Drew, waiting to hear what happened. Bernard probably hoping for the best. All those men trying to survive another day. Why me? Mason asked quietly. You must know hundreds of people more qualified. I know hundreds of people with credentials, Everett said. I know very few with character. And this work requires both. He was quiet for a moment. I lost my son 15 years ago, Philip. He struggled with addiction, and I didn't see it until it was too late. I was too busy building my business, accumulating wealth, proving whatever it was I thought I needed to prove. The pain in Everett's voice was unmistakable. After Philip died, I spent years trying to figure out how to make his life mean something. The foundation is part of that. But it's not enough to just build housing. I need people who understand what it's like to need help, who can offer it without condescension. Everett met Mason's eyes. You stopped in the snow to help a stranger because that's who you are. That's what I need. Mason thought about Drew, about second chances, about the weight of regret and the possibility of redemption. When would you need an answer? Take the weekend. Think about it. Discuss it with your son. Everett pulled a business card from his pocket, identical to the one he'd included with the letter. But Mason, I hope you'll say yes. Mason took the card, stood, and shook Everett's hand again. Thank you for the opportunity, his voice caught, for seeing something worth investing in. Thank you for being someone worth seeing. The bus ride back felt surreal. Mason sat with the leather folder on his lap, staring at nothing, his mind spinning through implications and possibilities and fears. Drew was waiting in the common room when Mason returned. He stood up immediately, his face tight with barely contained hope. Well, Mason led him outside, away from curious ears, and told him everything. The salary, the benefits, the housing assistance, the scope of the job, Everett's vision, the story about his son. Drew listened without interrupting, and when Mason finished, he just nodded slowly. You're going to take it, Drew said. Not a question. I told him I'd think about it. Dad, come on! Mason looked at his son. What if I'm not good enough? What if I take this job and fail, and we end up right back here? What if you take this job and succeed? Drew countered. What if this is the break we've been waiting for? What if... He stopped, emotion thickening his voice. What if you finally catch something good instead of just waiting for the next bad thing? That night Mason lay awake again, but this time hope and fear wrestled in equal measure. He thought about his father, who'd served in the army and taught Mason about duty and dignity, about doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. He thought about Sheila and how their marriage had fallen apart when money disappeared. About Drew growing up without stability, without trust that things could work out. He thought about all the men at Riverside who'd probably never get an offer like this. About Carlos and Eugene and Terry and the dozens of others just trying to survive. On Saturday morning, Mason called the number on the business card. Everett Langston. Mr. Langston, it's Mason Clarke. I've made my decision, and, Mason took a deep breath, I'd like to accept your offer. If it's still available, it is. And I'm glad. Genuine warmth filled Everett's voice. Can you come by the office Monday morning? We'll handle the paperwork, and I'll have Iris arrange the housing situation. Monday, yes, thank you. Thank you. Mason, I think we're going to do good work together. After hanging up, Mason sat for a long moment, letting the reality settle over him. Then he found Drew and told him. His son wrapped him in a fierce hug, and neither of them bothered hiding their tears. On Monday morning, Mason arrived at the gleaming tower at 8:30. This time, walking through those doors felt different. Not like an imposter, but like someone who belonged, or at least someone who was learning to belong. The paperwork took 2 hours. Employment contract, tax forms, direct deposit information, benefits enrollment. Iris walked him through everything patiently, answering questions he felt foolish asking, but needed to understand. And here's the housing arrangement, she said, sliding another form across the desk. The foundation maintains several furnished apartments for staff transitions. You and your son can move in immediately. First month is covered, and after that it's a reasonable rent until you're settled enough to find something permanent. Mason stared at the address. A real apartment. A door that locked. A kitchen. When can we move in? Today, if you'd like. I have the keys right here. That afternoon, Mason and Drew packed their belongings from the riverside shelter. It took less than an hour. Everything they owned fit into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. Bernard helped them carry it to the bus stop. I'm proud of you, Mason, Bernard said, shaking his hand. You earned this. I got lucky. You got seen. There's a difference. Bernard turned to Drew. Take care of your father. And yourself. Yes, sir. The apartment was in a modest building 15 minutes from downtown. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, furnished with simple but clean furniture. Mason stood in the doorway, unable to move, overwhelmed by the space and light and quiet. Drew walked through slowly, touching the walls as if to confirm they were real. He stopped in the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, empty but working, and turned to his father with tears streaming down his face. We have a home, Dad. Mason crossed the room and pulled his son into his arms. We have a home. That night they cooked dinner together, pasta from the grocery store 3 blocks away, sauce from a jar, garlic bread from the bakery section. Simple food that tasted like celebration. After dinner, Drew washed dishes while Mason stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, men were settling into their cots at Riverside. Somewhere out there, people were struggling and hoping and trying to survive. And here he was, in an apartment with his son, about to start a job that might actually mean something. Dad? Drew called from the kitchen. You okay? Mason turned from the window, smiling through the tightness in his throat. Yeah, son. I think I finally am. 3 months passed, like a dream Mason kept expecting to wake from. He started at the foundation the day after moving into the apartment, arriving early and staying late, determined to prove Everett's faith in him wasn't misplaced. The office was small, just 5 people, including Everett, but the work was substantial and deeply purposeful. Iris handled administration and coordinating with contractors. Gavin Strand, the architect, refined the building designs and managed the construction timeline. A quiet woman named Lydia processed applications and maintained the database. And Mason did the work that mattered most. He interviewed families. They came to the foundation office in a steady stream, referred by social workers and shelter directors and community organizations. Single mothers working multiple jobs. Couples recovering from medical bankruptcies. Veterans struggling to transition back to civilian life. Families who'd been 1 paycheck from stability before that paycheck disappeared. Mason sat across the desk from them, asked questions, and listened, really listened to their answers. He could hear the difference between someone explaining circumstances and someone making excuses. Between temporary setback and permanent resignation. Between people who needed a bridge and people who needed something he couldn't provide. It was harder than he'd expected, turning people away. But Everett had been clear. The foundation had limited resources, and helping the wrong families meant not helping the right ones. "You're good at this," Everett said one afternoon, reviewing Mason's recommendations. "Better than I'd hoped." "I just remember what it felt like," Mason said, sitting on the other side of that desk. One case stayed with Mason long after the interview ended. Vanessa Hartley, 34 years old, 2 kids, working 3 part-time jobs because none offered full-time hours or benefits. She'd been living in her sister's basement for 8 months, saving every spare dollar, but couldn't scrape together enough for first and last month's rent plus deposit. "I don't need charity," she'd said, her voice tired but firm. "I just need a chance. 1 year of stable housing and I can build from there." "I know I can." Mason had seen the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the determination. He'd approved her application immediately. Now watching her move into one of the completed units with her kids, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, both wide-eyed with wonder at having their own bedrooms, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. His friendship with Everett deepened as the weeks passed. They had lunch together most days, sometimes discussing foundation business, sometimes ranging into philosophy and life and regret. Everett spoke often about his son, Philip, and the conversations felt less like confessions than shared grief. "I gave him everything except my time," Everett said one afternoon. They were sitting in a small cafe near the office, rain streaking the windows. Money, opportunities, connections. But I was always working, always building the next thing. And Philip, he needed a father, not a benefactor. Mason thought about Drew, about the years they'd lost. "You can't change the past." "No, but you can try to honor it." Everett looked at him. "That's what you're doing with Drew, starting over, building something real." Trying to, anyway. Drew had found work at a distribution center, steady overnight shifts with benefits and decent pay. He came home exhausted each morning, slept through the afternoon, and left again at dusk. But he was saving money, talking about taking classes, mentioning a woman named Bethany who worked in the hospital cafeteria adjacent to his warehouse. "She's smart," Drew said one evening, the closest he'd come to admitting real interest. "And she doesn't take my nonsense." "Sounds promising," Mason said, hiding his smile. "Don't make it weird, Dad." But Mason was grateful for Drew's job, for his growing stability, for the lightness returning to his son's eyes. One evening, Mason unpacked a box he'd been avoiding since the move. Inside was a framed photograph of his father in his army dress uniform, taken shortly before his deployment to Vietnam. Stern face, straight posture, eyes that had seen hard things but remained kind. Mason placed the frame on his desk at the foundation office, next to his computer. Every morning, arriving at work, he'd see it and remember what his father used to say: "Do the right thing, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching." In late March, Paula called. Mason hadn't spoken to his sister in over 2 years. Not since she'd offered to help with rent and he'd refused, too proud or too ashamed to accept. Her voice on the phone was cautious, testing whether old wounds still bled. "I saw an article," she said, "about the Langston Foundation housing project. There was a photo of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. You were in the background." "Yeah, I work there now." A long pause. "You work there? Like actually work there?" He told her the story, the flat tire, the job offer the past 3 months. Paula listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was crying. "Mason, I'm so happy for you. And I'm sorry." "For what?" "For letting you pull away. For not trying harder to help. I wouldn't have accepted it," Mason admitted. "I wasn't ready. Are you ready now?" He thought about that. "Maybe. Yeah, I think so." Paula invited them to Sunday dinner, her husband Glenn, their 2 teenage daughters. Mason accepted, then spent the week anxious about seeing family he'd avoided for so long. The house was in the suburbs, a modest split level with a well-maintained lawn. Paula answered the door, older but unmistakably his sister, with the same eyes and cautious smile. She hugged him tightly, then turned to Drew. "Look at you. You were 14 last time I saw you." "Yeah," Drew said awkwardly. "Sorry about that." "Don't be. You're here now." Dinner was both painful and healing. Paula's daughters, 16 and 13, were polite but curious, asking careful questions about where Mason and Drew had been living. Glenn was quiet and kind, passing dishes and keeping conversation flowing when it stalled. "I wanted to help," Paula said as they cleared plates. "When you lost your job, when Sheila left. But I shut everyone out," Mason finished. "I thought accepting help meant admitting failure. And now I understand that asking for help is different than needing it. And that family should have been there regardless." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry I made it so hard." Paula squeezed his hand. Fresh start. Fresh start. At the office, the first housing complex was now fully occupied. 50 families, including Vanessa and her kids. Mason visited the property twice a week, checking in, troubleshooting problems, connecting residents with job training and financial counseling. He watched Vanessa cut back to 2 jobs, then 1 full-time position with benefits. Watched her kids settle into their new school, making friends, bringing home better grades. Watched the exhaustion fade from her face, replaced by something like hope. "You changed my life," she told him once. "You changed your own life," Mason corrected. "We just gave you the space to do it." But late at night in his apartment, Mason sometimes felt the imposter syndrome creeping back. He'd look around at the furniture, the kitchen, the framed photo of his father, and wonder when it would all disappear. When Everett would realize he'd made a mistake. When circumstances would shift and he'd find himself back at Riverside, starting over again. Drew seemed to sense these moments. He'd appear in the doorway with coffee, sit without speaking, just being present until the anxiety passed. "You deserve this, Dad," he said once. "Some days I believe that. Believe it every day." In early April, Everett called Mason into his office with news. "I want to make your position permanent and official. Assistant Director of Community Outreach. Salary increase, more responsibility, your own office." Mason's hands shook as he signed the contract. That evening, he took Drew to dinner at a real restaurant. Not fancy, but sit down with actual menus and a server who brought water in glasses. They ordered burgers and talked about Drew's plans to propose to Bethany, about Paula's invitation to the girls' spring concert, about the second housing complex scheduled to break ground in June. "We made it," Drew said quietly. Mason looked at his son across the table, 24 years old, employed, in love, building a future that looked nothing like his past. "Yeah," Mason said. "We really did." The voicemail came on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. Mason was reviewing applications in his new office, small but his own, with a window overlooking the street, when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, so he let it go to voicemail. When he checked it during his lunch break, a woman's voice filled his ear, familiar and impossible. "Mason, it's Sheila. I saw you in the newspaper. An article about the Housing Foundation. You looked good, healthy." A pause, the sound of breath catching. "I know I have no right to call after all this time, but I'd really like to talk to you. There are things I need to say. Please call me back." Mason sat frozen, his sandwich forgotten. Sheila, his ex-wife. The woman who'd walked out 12 years ago when the money disappeared, who'd remarried within 6 months, who'd abandoned Drew and never looked back. He deleted the voicemail, then immediately regretted it. Then felt relieved he'd deleted it. Then angry at himself for feeling anything at all. That evening, Drew noticed something was wrong immediately. What happened? Mason told him about the voicemail. Drew's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, anger, then something harder to define. "You're not going to call her back," Drew said. "Not a question, more like a protective demand." "I don't know." "Dad, seriously? After everything she did?" "She said she needed to talk. She needed to talk 12 years ago. She needed to talk when you lost the house. When we were living in that crappy apartment eating ramen for dinner." Drew's voice rose. "She didn't need to talk then, and she doesn't get to need it now." Mason understood his son's anger, shared it even. But something in Sheila's voice had sounded broken in a way he recognized. Not manipulative, but genuinely fractured. "Maybe people change," he said quietly. "And maybe they don't. Maybe they just want something." Over the next few days, Sheila called twice more. Mason didn't answer, but he saved the voicemail this time. In the second one, she mentioned being sick. In the third, She asked specifically about Drew, whether he was okay, whether he'd finished college. The fact that she didn't know whether her own son had gone to college said everything about the past 12 years. At work, Mason threw himself into planning the second housing complex. The property was larger, 80 units instead of 50, in a neighborhood that desperately needed revitalization. Kevin had designed something beautiful and practical, with community spaces and a small park for children. Everett wanted Mason to lead the applicant selection process entirely, training 2 new staff members in his methods. It was overwhelming and validating in equal measure. "You've become essential to this organization," Everett said during one of their lunches. "I can't imagine doing this work without you." "That's generous." "It's accurate." Everett studied him. "Something's troubling you, though." "I can see it." Mason hesitated, then told him about Sheila's calls, about Drew's anger, his own confusion, the old wounds that apparently hadn't healed as much as he'd thought. "What do you want to do?" Everett asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to hear what she has to say. Part of me thinks Drew's right, that she just wants something now that I have something to give. Those aren't mutually exclusive," Everett pointed out. "She could want something and also genuinely want to make amends. Does it matter?" "That depends. Do you need closure?" Mason thought about that for a long time. "Maybe. Yeah, maybe I do." He called Sheila that evening from his office after everyone else had gone home. His hands shook as he dialed, and his voice sounded strange in the empty space. She answered on the second ring. "Mason?" "Yeah, it's me. Thank you for calling back. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't." A pause. "That's fair. Mason, I need to see you, in person. There are things I need to tell you, things I can't say over the phone." Every instinct told him to refuse, but curiosity and old grief and the faint possibility of closure won out. "Coffee, Saturday afternoon. The place on 7th Street near the shelter." "I remember it." 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock. After hanging up, Mason sat in the dark office for a long time, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake. Drew didn't speak to him for 2 days after Mason told him about the meeting. When he finally did, his words were clipped and careful. "I'm not going with you. I didn't ask you to, and I don't want to see her. Not now, not ever. That's your choice, Drew. I respect it. Do you? Because it feels like you're choosing her over me. I'm not choosing anyone. I'm just—" Mason struggled for the right words. "I'm trying to understand what happened, to put that part of my life to rest. It is at rest. You're the one digging it back up." Saturday arrived cold and drizzly. Mason walked to the coffee shop, arriving 15 minutes early. He ordered black coffee and sat at a corner table, watching the door, his stomach tight with anxiety. Sheila arrived exactly at 2 o'clock. Mason barely recognized her. She'd aged more than 12 years should account for, her face drawn, her hair thinner, her body smaller inside her coat. She moved carefully, like someone who hurt, and when she sat across from him, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said you needed to talk." "I do. But first, you look good, Mason, really good. The article said you work for the Langston Foundation now?" "I do." "That's wonderful. I'm happy for you." The words felt genuine, which somehow made everything harder. Mason waited. Sheila wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm sick. Stage 4 cancer, pancreatic. They're saying 6 months, maybe less." The words hung between them. Mason felt sympathy war with old anger, and neither emotion won. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Thank you." She met his eyes. "I wanted to apologize. For leaving the way I did. For taking the money. For—" Her voice broke. "For abandoning Drew. For being weak when you needed me to be strong. Why now?" "Because I'm dying, and I need you to know I'm sorry. That I was wrong. That I've lived with the guilt every day since." Tears tracked down her face. "I was scared, Mason. We were losing everything, and I panicked. I thought marrying Roger would fix things, but all it did was prove I'd made the worst mistake of my life." Mason watched her cry and felt nothing. Or not nothing, but nothing simple. Pity, yes. Sadness for wasted years and broken promises. But not the anger he'd expected, and not the lingering love he'd feared. "I forgive you," he said quietly, and realized as he said it that he meant it. Sheila looked up surprised. Just like that? Just like that. Holding on to anger hasn't helped me, and it won't help you. So yes, I forgive you. And Drew? Drew makes his own choices. I can't speak for him. Sheila nodded, accepting this. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the table. What's this? Mason asked. Open it. Inside were legal documents. Mason scanned the first page, then looked up sharply. This is a motion to modify our divorce decree. I need your help, Mason. The medical bills, I can't afford them. Roger left me when the diagnosis came. I have nothing. She leaned forward. The article said you work for a billionaire now. Surely you have access to money. I'm not asking for much. Just enough to cover treatment, to buy me a few more months. Mason stared at her, understanding crystallizing like ice in his chest. You're not here to apologize. I am apologizing. But I also need help from the man you abandoned. The son you haven't contacted in 12 years. Mason stood, the chair scraping loud in the quiet cafe. You saw me in the paper and thought what? That I owed you something. Mason, please, no! He left the documents on the table. I meant it when I said I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean letting you use me. He walked out into the rain, leaving Sheila sitting alone with her legal papers and her regrets. Mason walked through the rain for over an hour, his mind replaying the conversation, the betrayal settling deeper with each step. By the time he reached his apartment, he was soaked through and furious. At Sheila, at himself for hoping she'd changed, at the universe for the cruel timing of it all. Drew was waiting in the living room. One look at Mason's face told him everything. She wanted money, Drew said flatly. Mason peeled off his wet jacket. Yeah, she did. I told you. You did. Mason sat heavily on the couch. She's dying, Drew. Stage 4 cancer. 6 months, maybe. Drew's expression didn't soften. And she thought that entitled her to your help. Our help, technically. She's filing to modify the divorce decree, claiming I abandoned her financially, that I owe her support. Mason rubbed his face. She brought legal documents to what I thought was an apology. Jesus, Dad. I walked out, left the papers on the table. They sat in silence for a while, the rain drumming against the windows. Finally, Drew spoke, his voice quieter. Are you okay? I don't know. I forgave her, meant it even, but then she... Mason shook his head. I thought maybe people could change, that second chances were real. They are real. Look at us. Look at what Everett did for you. Drew leaned forward. But some people don't want to change. They just want to take. Monday morning, Mason arrived at work early and found Everett already in his office. He knocked on the open door. Got a minute? Everett looked up from his computer. Always. Come in. Mason told him everything. The coffee shop meeting, Sheila's illness, the legal documents. Everett listened without interrupting, his expression growing more somber. I'm sorry, Mason. That's a profound betrayal. The thing is, I feel bad for her. She's dying, she's alone, she's scared. But you also have to protect yourself, Everett finished. Compassion doesn't require self-destruction. Drew thinks I should ignore it completely. But those legal papers, can she actually claim part of my salary? Let me make some calls. Everett picked up his phone. The foundation has excellent attorneys. We'll figure out what you're dealing with. By Wednesday, Mason met with Jonathan Reeves, one of the foundation's lawyers. Reeves was in his 50s, methodical and calm. The kind of person who made complicated things feel manageable. I've reviewed the documents, Reeves said, spreading them across the conference table. Her claim is weak. The divorce was finalized 12 years ago with a clear settlement. She took half the assets, which weren't much, admittedly, and there was no alimony agreement. So she can't touch my salary? Not based on these filings, however. Reeves paused. She could make this very public and very messy. File motions, request hearings, drag you through court. Even if she ultimately loses, the process would be expensive and time-consuming. She's hoping I'll settle. Most likely offer her something to avoid the hassle. Reeves leaned back. The question is whether you want to fight this on principle or end it quickly. Mason thought about the foundation. about the families depending on their work, about the public nature of what they were building. A messy court battle would create exactly the kind of attention that could damage everything. How much would she likely accept as a settlement, based on her medical situation and financial need? Probably $50,000 to $75,000. The number hit Mason like a physical blow. More money than he'd had in his entire life until 3 months ago. Money that would help a dying woman, yes, but also reward her manipulation. I need to think about it. That evening, Mason called Paula. He hadn't told her about Sheila yet, and as he explained the situation, he could hear her anger building through the phone. "She has some nerve," Paula said. "After everything she did to you and Drew." "I know, but she's dying, Paula." "Plenty of people die without extorting their ex-husbands." Paula sighed. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to just pay her and be done with it. But Drew's furious. He sees it as giving in to manipulation." "What does Everett say?" "That compassion doesn't require self-destruction." "Smart man." Paula was quiet for a moment. "Mason, listen to me. You've spent 12 years carrying guilt about the divorce, about the job loss, about everything falling apart. But none of that was your fault. Sheila made her choices. She chose to leave. She chose to take the money. She chose to abandon her son. She's scared and alone and dying, and that's genuinely sad. But it doesn't obligate you to save her. You didn't create this situation, she did, with 12 years of absence and now one conversation motivated by greed." Mason knew his sister was right, but knowing didn't make the decision easier. At work, the foundation's expansion continued. Everett announced plans for not just the second housing complex, but a third, pending donor commitments. Mason would oversee community outreach for all 3 properties, managing a team of 5 people. "You've exceeded every expectation," Everett told him during one of their lunches. "You've taken this role and made it something I couldn't have envisioned. I just do what needs doing." "That's exactly why you're good at it." Everett studied him. "Have you decided about Sheila?" "Not yet. Every option feels wrong." "Then maybe the answer isn't about her. Maybe it's about you, what you can live with, what serves your integrity." That night, Everett shared something he'd never mentioned before. He pulled an old leather journal from his briefcase, worn and filled with handwriting. "I kept this during the year after Philip died," he said, handing it to Mason. "The therapist suggested it might help process the grief." Mason opened it carefully. The entries were raw: guilt, regret, anger at himself for missing the signs of Philip's addiction. Pages and pages of a father's anguish. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I see you struggling with something similar, the weight of wondering. If you're being cruel or kind, whether you owe someone something because of shared history." Everett pointed to a specific entry. "Read that one." Mason read the date, 3 years after Philip's death, and the entry beneath it: "I've spent years trying to earn forgiveness from someone who can't grant it, trying to make amends for mistakes that can't be undone. Today, my therapist asked me a question that changed everything. Whose forgiveness are you actually seeking, Philip's or your own? The answer was mine. It's always been mine. So I'm choosing to forgive myself. Not because I didn't make mistakes. I did. Terrible ones. But because punishing myself forever doesn't honor Philip's memory. Building something that helps others does." Mason closed the journal slowly, his eyes stinging. "You're wondering if helping Sheila would be the compassionate thing," Everett said quietly, "or if refusing is self-protection. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is establish boundaries. For yourself, for Drew, for the life you're building. She's dying alone. That's her consequence to bear. You didn't create it." Mason went home that night and found Drew in the kitchen, making dinner. Bethany was there too, a kind-faced young woman with gentle eyes who'd clearly been good for his son. "Dad, this is Bethany. Officially. We've met before, Mr. Clarke," she said, smiling. "Call me Mason, and it's good to see you again." They ate together, the three of them, talking about ordinary things. Drew's promotion possibility, Bethany's nursing school applications, Paula's invitation to a family barbecue. Normal life, simple and precious. After Bethany left, Drew helped Mason clean up. "I've decided about your mom," Mason said. "I'm going to fight the claim. No settlement." Drew looked at him surprised. "Really? Really? She made her choices. I forgive her for them, but that doesn't mean accepting the consequences of them for her." Mason put a hand on his son's shoulder. "You were right. Some people want to change, and some people just want to take. I'm done letting people take from us." Drew hugged him, fierce and sudden. "I'm proud of you, Dad." "Yeah," Mason said, his voice rough. "I'm starting to be proud of me, too." The next morning, Mason called Jonathan Reeves and told him to fight the claim. No settlement, no compromise. Reeves outlined the strategy: file a motion to dismiss, prepare character witnesses, document Sheila's 12-year absence and her motivation for suddenly reappearing. "This will likely go to court," Reeves warned. "She'll play the sympathy card. Dying woman, desperate circumstances. Are you prepared for that?" "I am." "Good. We'll start building your case." Over the next 2 weeks, Sheila's attorney sent increasingly aggressive letters. The tone shifted from requesting support to demanding it, threatening media exposure and public embarrassment. They claimed Mason had a moral obligation to help his dying ex-wife, that his newfound wealth made him culpable. Each letter made Mason angrier, not at the legal maneuvering, but at the presumption that success created obligation to those who'd abandoned him during failure. Meanwhile, the foundation faced its own crisis. One of their major donors, a tech entrepreneur who'd pledged $2 million toward the second housing complex, pulled out unexpectedly. Market concerns, he claimed, though rumors suggested his wife was divorcing him and assets were being frozen. Without that funding, construction couldn't begin. 80 families on the waiting list would remain waiting indefinitely. Everett called an emergency staff meeting. "We need to replace that funding within 60 days, or we lose the property. I'm reaching out to my contacts, but I need ideas from all of you." "What about a fundraising event?" Iris suggested. "Something that showcases what we've accomplished." "A gala," Kevin added. "Show donors the actual families we've helped. Let them see the impact." Everett looked at Mason. "What do you think?" "I think people give to stories, not statistics. If we can tell our story, the real story, with real people, we might have a chance. Then that's what we'll do." Everett stood. "Mason, I want you to speak at the gala. Tell your story." Mason's stomach dropped. "My story?" "How you came to work here. What this foundation means to someone who's lived the experience our clients face." Everett's expression was gentle but firm. "You're the heart of this organization. People need to hear from you." That evening, Mason sat at his kitchen table with a blank notebook, trying to figure out what to say. How do you distill homelessness, divorce, failure, and unexpected redemption into a speech that would convince wealthy people to open their checkbooks? Drew found him there an hour later, the page still mostly blank. "Having trouble? I don't know how to talk about all this." "About the shelter, about—" Mason gestured vaguely. "About being desperate. Tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask." "The truth is messy and embarrassing." "The truth is human," Drew corrected. "And that's what people respond to." Mason started writing. He wrote about losing his job, about his marriage falling apart, about the slow descent from middle-class stability to sleeping in a shelter. He wrote about shame and pride and the particular exhaustion of hopelessness. He wrote about the snowy night and the flat tire, about Everett's unexpected kindness, about the black Rolls-Royce and the cream-colored envelope that changed everything. And he wrote about what happened after, not just the job and the apartment, but the restoration of dignity, the ability to help others the way he'd been helped, the knowledge that circumstances didn't define worth. It took him 3 days to finish the first draft. He showed it to Everett, who read it in silence, then looked up with tears in his eyes. "This is perfect. Don't change a word." The gala was scheduled for a Friday evening in early June at an elegant hotel ballroom downtown. Mason had never been to an event like it. crystal chandeliers, white-clothed tables, a silent auction featuring artwork and vacation packages that cost more than his annual shelter fee. Paula and Glenn came, and Drew brought Bethany. They sat at a table near the back, visible enough for Mason to see them, but not so close as to make him more nervous. Everett had invited everyone. The city's philanthropic community, business leaders, foundation board members. 200 people in expensive clothes, eating elaborate food, making polite conversation about charitable giving. Mason stood backstage in his borrowed suit. Everett had insisted on taking him to a proper tailor and tried to remember how to breathe. "You'll be great," Iris assured him, adjusting his tie. "Just speak from the heart." At 8 o'clock, Everett took the stage. He talked about the foundation's mission, the housing completed, the families served. He showed photographs of the properties, statistics about employment rates, and school attendance among residents. Then he said, "But numbers don't tell the whole story. For that, I'd like to introduce someone who's lived it. Mason Clarke, our Director of Community Outreach." The applause was polite but impersonal. Mason walked onto the stage, the microphone suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. He looked out at the sea of faces, mostly white, mostly wealthy, mostly people whose problems had never included where to sleep or whether to eat. He saw Drew giving him a thumbs up, Paula beaming with pride, Everett nodding encouragement. Mason gripped the microphone and began. 8 months ago, I was living in the Riverside men's shelter with my son. I was 51 years old, working day labor when I could find it, trying to keep hope alive, even though hope felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. The room quieted. People stopped looking at their phones. I'd lost my construction job in the recession, lost my marriage, lost eventually everything I thought defined me as a man, provider, father, success. I ended up in that shelter not because I'd made one bad choice, but because a series of circumstances I couldn't control finally overwhelmed the dignity I was trying to maintain. Mason's voice grew steadier as he continued. He told them about the snowy evening, the stranded car, changing Everett's tire without hesitation because that's what his father had taught him. You help people, even when you have nothing to give. He told them about the Rolls-Royce arriving at the shelter, about opening the envelope with shaking hands, about calling the number and meeting Everett in this very building. Mr. Langston didn't offer me charity. He offered me dignity, a real job, with real expectations and real consequences if I failed. He saw something in me that I'd forgotten to see in myself, that circumstances don't define worth. That a man living in a shelter with worn-out work gloves might still have something valuable to offer. The room was completely silent now. This foundation doesn't just build housing, it builds bridges between crisis and stability, between homelessness and home, between despair and hope. The families we serve aren't looking for handouts. They're looking for what Everett gave me, a chance. One real chance to prove what they're capable of when someone believes in them. Mason paused, looking directly at the audience. Right now, we have 80 families on our waiting list. Working people, parents, veterans, people who fell through cracks that shouldn't exist but do. Without your support tonight, those families stay in shelters, in cars, in situations no one should endure. He told them about Vanessa, about watching her kids see their own bedrooms for the first time. About the single father who got a job because he finally had an address for applications. About the veteran who stopped having nightmares once he had walls and a door that locked. I'm standing here tonight because one man stopped to see me as a person, not a problem. Because he believed that everyone deserves a second chance, and he put his money where his values are. Mason's voice thickened. I'm asking you to do the same. Not for me, but for the families still waiting. Still hoping, still believing that someone might see them the way Everett saw me. He finished with the truth he discovered through his own transformation. Poverty doesn't mean you've given up. Sometimes it just means you haven't been given the chance yet. Help us give that chance. The applause started slowly, then built into a standing ovation that lasted until Mason left the stage, his hands shaking and his eyes wet. Everett met him backstage, pulling him into a fierce hug. That was extraordinary. Within an hour, the pledges started coming in. By the end of the evening, they'd raised $3 million, $1 million more than they'd lost. The second housing complex was saved. The week after the gala, Mason's life became unexpectedly public. A local news station had covered the event, and his story, "Man helps stranger, stranger changes his life," resonated beyond the philanthropic community. Reporters called the foundation office requesting interviews. A morning show wanted him to appear. Social media posts about his speech went viral. Everett fielded most of the requests, protecting Mason from the overwhelming attention. But he agreed to one interview. A respected journalist from the city's main newspaper who wanted to write a feature about the foundation and the people it served. The article ran on a Sunday, front page of the lifestyle section. It included photographs of Mason at work, of the housing complexes, of Vanessa and her children in their apartment. The headline read, "From shelter resident to foundation director, one man's journey from rock bottom to giving back." Mason read it alone in his apartment, uncomfortable with seeing his life reduced to inspiring narrative. But the article was honest and respectful, capturing not just his story, but the foundation's broader mission. Paula called immediately after reading it. "Mason, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you. It feels weird having everyone know. Let them know. You earned this, and your story matters." By Monday, donation inquiries flooded the foundation office. Small amounts mostly, $20 here, $50 there, from people who saw themselves in Mason's struggle. Working families, single parents, people one paycheck from crisis who wanted to help others avoid that precipice. "This is what I hoped for," Everett said, reviewing the donations with Iris. "Not just wealthy donors, but community investment. People who understand because they've lived it." But the publicity had another consequence. On Wednesday morning, Jonathan Reeves called Mason into a private meeting. "Sheila's attorney has changed tactics," Reeves said, his expression grim. "They're using your public profile to strengthen their case." "How?" "They're arguing that your newfound success, the salary, the media attention, the public platform, creates a moral and financial obligation to support your terminally ill ex-wife." Reeves slid a document across the desk. "They're also requesting an expedited hearing. Her health is deteriorating, and they want resolution before she dies," Mason finished. "Yes, the judge granted the request. We're scheduled for next Friday." Mason felt the weight of it settle over him. 10 days. 10 days to prepare for a court battle that would determine not just money, but something deeper, whether his success obligated him to those who'd abandoned him during failure. That evening, he told Drew about the court date. His son's reaction was immediate and fierce. "She's playing the sympathy card. Dying woman, heartless ex-husband with money. That's the angle." "I know, but you're still going to fight it." "I am." Mason looked at his son. "Not because I want to hurt her, but because giving in means accepting that her abandoning us was somehow justified. That we deserved it." Drew nodded slowly. "I'll testify if you need me to. Tell them what it was like when she left. Jonathan said we might need character witnesses. People who can speak to what happened back then and what's happened since. Then I'll do it. Paula too, probably. And Everett." Over the next week, Jonathan prepared Mason meticulously. They reviewed the divorce decree, the timeline of Sheila's absence, the documentation of her remarriage and subsequent divorce from Roger. They prepared responses to expected arguments, practiced testimony, role-played cross-examination. "They'll try to make you look cold," Jonathan warned. "A successful man refusing to help his dying ex-wife. You need to stay calm, compassionate even while maintaining your position. I can be sorry she's dying without being responsible for saving her." "Exactly. That's the line we're walking." The Friday of the hearing arrived grey and cold. Mason put on his best suit, the one from the gala, properly his now, and met Jonathan at the courthouse. It was family court, not criminal, but the formality still made Mason's stomach tight with anxiety. Drew was already there, sitting on a bench outside the courtroom with Paula and Glenn. Everett arrived moments later, placing a reassuring hand on Mason's shoulder. Whatever happens, you've got people who believe in you. Thank you for everything. Thank me by staying strong in there. At 9 o'clock they entered the courtroom. It was smaller than Mason expected, almost intimate, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that hummed quietly. Sheila sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s named Patricia Holbrook. Sheila looked worse than she had at the coffee shop. Thinner, greyer, wearing a scarf that might have been covering hair loss from chemotherapy. She glanced at Mason once, her expression unreadable, then looked away. The judge entered, a black woman in her 60s named Judge Carol Warren, and everyone stood. She reviewed the case briefly, then gestured for them to sit. "This is a motion to modify a 12-year-old divorce decree," Judge Warren said, looking over her reading glasses. "Ms. Holbrook, make your case." Patricia Holbrook stood, commanding the room with practiced confidence. She painted Sheila as a woman who'd made mistakes, but was now facing mortality alone and desperate. She emphasized Mason's recent success, the salary, the public platform, the evidence of financial stability. "Mr. Clarke has the means to help," Holbrook argued. "And given their shared history, their marriage, their son together, he has a moral obligation to provide support during her final months. We're not asking for excessive amounts. $50,000 to cover medical expenses. That's all?" She called Sheila to the stand. Sheila took the oath with a trembling hand, then answered questions in a weak voice. Yes, she'd made mistakes leaving Mason. Yes, she regretted abandoning Drew, but she'd been young and scared, and didn't everyone deserve forgiveness? "I'm dying," Sheila said, tears streaming down her face. "I have 6 weeks, maybe. I just want to spend that time in comfort, not in pain worrying about bills. Mason has money now. Surely he can spare something for the mother of his child." It was effective. Mason could see the sympathy on Judge Warren's face. Then Jonathan cross-examined. Gently but firmly, he established the facts. Sheila had left voluntarily when Mason lost his job. She'd taken half their savings, admittedly small, but everything they had. She'd remarried within 6 months to a man with means. She hadn't contacted Drew in 12 years, despite knowing where he was. "Mrs. Clarke, Mrs. Brennan now, when did you first reach out to Mr. Clarke after your divorce?" "This spring, when I saw the newspaper article. So 12 years passed without any contact." "Yes. And in those 12 years, did you ever reach out to your son?" "No, I didn't. Did you send birthday cards? Christmas gifts? Any acknowledgement of his existence?" "No. But now that Mr. Clarke has achieved some financial stability, you felt it was appropriate to contact him requesting money." Sheila's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Judge Warren made a note. When it was Mason's turn to testify, he kept his voice steady and his answers direct. Yes, he felt compassion for Sheila's situation. Yes, her diagnosis was tragic. But compassion didn't equal obligation, especially after 12 years of complete absence. "She left when things got hard," Mason said. "She abandoned our son. She chose someone else over us. I've forgiven her for that. But forgiveness doesn't mean accepting financial responsibility for choices she made." "You have substantial income now," Judge Warren noted. $50,000 wouldn't create hardship for you. It's not about hardship, Your Honor. It's about principle. If I pay her now, what am I teaching my son? That abandonment is acceptable as long as you come back when it's convenient? That success obligates you to those who hurt you? Jonathan called Drew to the stand. Mason's son testified with controlled anger about his mother's absence, about growing up without her, about the message it would send if Mason gave in to this demand. Then Paula testified, describing how she'd offered help 12 years ago, and Mason had refused out of pride. But Sheila had simply disappeared. Finally, Everett took the stand. His testimony focused not on Sheila's character, but on Mason's, his integrity, his work ethic, his genuine care for the families the foundation served. "Mason Clarke is one of the most decent men I've ever met," Everett said. "He helps people because it's right, not because it benefits him. But there's a difference between helping and being exploited." After all testimony concluded, Judge Warren called a brief recess. Mason stood in the courthouse hallway with Drew, Paula, and Everett, none of them speaking. The weight of waiting pressed down like humidity before a storm. "You did well in there," Jonathan said quietly. "Stayed calm, stayed honest. Did it matter?" Mason asked. "We'll know soon." 20 minutes later, they filed back into the courtroom. Judge Warren had returned to the bench, reading glasses perched on her nose, a stack of documents before her. Her expression gave nothing away. "I've reviewed the motion, heard testimony from both parties, and examined the relevant documentation," she began. "This case presents an interesting ethical question, whether moral obligation translates to legal responsibility. Ms. Holbrook has argued persuasively that Mr. Clarke has both the means and the moral duty to help his former wife in her final weeks." Mason felt Drew tense beside him. "However," Judge Warren continued, "the law is clear on this matter. The divorce was finalized 12 years ago with a comprehensive settlement agreement. Both parties accepted the terms. There was no provision for future support, no alimony arrangement, and no clause allowing modification based on changed circumstances." She looked directly at Sheila. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm sympathetic to your situation. Cancer is a terrible disease, and facing it alone must be frightening. But the fact remains that you voluntarily ended your marriage to Mr. Clarke. You remarried. You maintained no contact with him or your son for over a decade. And you only reached out when you saw evidence of his financial success." Sheila's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges her mistakes." "Ms. Holbrook, I'm not finished." Judge Warren's tone was firm but not unkind. "Your client may indeed regret her past choices, but regret doesn't create legal obligation. Mr. Clarke has no more responsibility to support Mrs. Brennan than he would any other ex-spouse from a decade-old divorce." She turned to Mason. "Mr. Clarke, I commend you for expressing forgiveness and compassion during your testimony. Those are admirable qualities, but the court cannot compel you to act on them financially. You've built a new life after considerable hardship. You owe Mrs. Brennan nothing." Judge Warren picked up her gavel. "The motion to modify the divorce decree is denied. Furthermore, Mrs. Brennan is ordered to pay Mr. Clarke's legal fees associated with defending against this motion. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sound like punctuation. Final, definitive. Mason sat motionless for a moment, letting the decision settle over him. Drew grabbed his arm, squeezing hard. Paula was crying. Everett nodded with quiet satisfaction. Across the aisle, Sheila stood slowly, leaning heavily on her attorney. She looked at Mason once more, and this time he saw not manipulation, but genuine defeat. For just a moment, he felt the old instinct to help, to fix, to take care of someone in pain. Then he remembered Drew at 14, confused and angry about why his mother had left. Drew at 17, pulling away because he couldn't trust anyone not to abandon him. Drew at 24, finally rebuilding a life because his father had shown him that stability was possible. Sheila had made her choices. Mason had made his. As they left the courtroom, Sheila's voice followed them. "Mason, wait!" He stopped but didn't turn around immediately. Drew's hand tightened on his arm protectively. "Please," Sheila said. Mason turned. She stood in the hallway, her attorney gone. Just a sick woman in a scarf looking older than her years. "I really am sorry," she said quietly. "For all of it." "I know you don't believe me, but it's true." "I do believe you," Mason said. "But sorry doesn't undo 12 years. It doesn't give Drew back his mother or me back the years I spent wondering what I did wrong. I know." Sheila's voice broke. "I just wanted you to hear it one more time." Mason nodded once, then turned and walked away with his family beside him. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. Paula hugged Mason fiercely, then Drew, then Everett. Jonathan shook everyone's hands and promised to send the final paperwork within the week. "Lunch," Everett suggested. "I think this calls for celebration." They went to a restaurant nearby, nothing fancy, just good food and better company. Drew sat beside Bethany, who joined them after the hearing ended. Paul and Glenn ordered wine. Everett told stories about his early business days, making everyone laugh. Mason mostly listened, grateful for the noise and warmth, for people who'd stood beside him when it mattered. "To Mason," Everett said, raising his glass. For choosing integrity over expedience. To Dad, Drew added. For showing me what strength actually looks like. Mason felt his throat tighten. To second chances, he said quietly, and to the people who make them possible. The following Monday, Mason returned to work energized. The court case had been a distraction, but now it was finished. He could focus entirely on the foundation's expansion. The second housing complex broke ground that week. Mason stood with Everett and the construction crew for the ceremonial first shovel of dirt, cameras clicking, reporters taking notes. It felt surreal. 2 years ago, he'd been swinging hammers on construction sites, and now he was overseeing projects that would house hundreds of families. You've come a long way, Kevin said, standing beside him as the excavators began clearing the lot. We all have, Mason replied. Applications for the new units were already flooding in. Mason spent his days interviewing families, each story both unique and familiar. Single parents, veterans, working people caught in the gap between poverty and stability. He saw his own past in every face, heard his own struggles in every voice. And he approved them carefully, thoughtfully, knowing that each decision meant the difference between hope and despair for someone who'd run out of options. One afternoon, Everett called him into his office with news. I'm promoting you to Associate Director, effective immediately. Mason stared. Everett, I've only been here 8 months, and you've transformed this organization in those 8 months. You've created protocols, trained staff, brought in funding through your story. Everett smiled. More importantly, you understand the mission at a level I never could. You've lived it. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and an office twice the size of his current one. Mason accepted, still somewhat stunned, and immediately thought about calling Drew to share the news. His son's reaction was pure joy. Dad, that's incredible. We need to celebrate. Dinner this weekend? Bring Bethany. Actually, Drew paused. I was going to wait, but since we're celebrating anyway, I'm going to propose to her. This Saturday, I wanted you to know first. Mason's eyes burned. Drew, that's wonderful. I know we're young, and it's fast, but she's it. Dad, I know it. Then I'm happy for you, truly. That Saturday evening, Mason waited anxiously by his phone until Drew called, his voice shaking with emotion. She said yes. Congratulations, son. I'm so proud of you. Later that night, Mason sat alone in his apartment, looking at the framed photograph of his father on the shelf. In uniform, young and serious, embarking on a life that would include war and work, and a son who'd eventually lose his way before finding it again. I think I'm getting it right now, Dad, Mason said quietly to the photograph. I think we're going to be okay. The next morning, he received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a woman's voice said, Mr. Clarke, this is Riverview Hospice. I'm calling about Sheila Brennan. She asked me to contact you. Mason's stomach dropped. Is she? She passed away early this morning. Peacefully in her sleep, the nurse paused. She left a note for you. Would you like me to read it? Mason sat down slowly. Yes, please. The nurse's voice was gentle as she read, Mason, thank you for forgiving me, even though I didn't deserve it. You were always better than me. Take care of Drew. Tell him I'm sorry I wasn't the mother he deserved. And thank you for changing that tire, for being kind to a stranger even when you had nothing. The world needs more people like you. Mason sat with the phone pressed to his ear long after the nurse finished reading, tears streaming down his face, for the woman Sheila might have been, for the years wasted, for the forgiveness he'd offered just in time. 6 months later, Mason stood in the backyard of a small house on Maple Street, watching Drew and Bethany cut their wedding cake under strings of lights as autumn leaves drifted down around them. It had been a simple ceremony, 40 guests, Paula's backyard, a minister who'd known the family for years. Drew had worn a navy suit and couldn't stop smiling. Bethany had looked radiant in a cream-colored dress. And Mason had walked his son down the aisle, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Now, as evening settled over the celebration, Mason found himself standing slightly apart from the crowd, taking it all in. Paula was dancing with Glenn. Everett was deep in conversation with the minister. Kevin and Iris from the foundation had come, along with several families from the housing complexes, including Vanessa and her children. "Dad?" Drew appeared beside him, still grinning. "You okay?" "More than okay. I'm perfect. Thank you for everything, for not giving up, for getting us here." Mason pulled his son into a hug. "You got yourself here. I just held on. We held on together." After Drew returned to his bride, Everett joined Mason at the edge of the yard. "Beautiful ceremony," Everett said. "It was." Mason watched the guests laughing and dancing. "Hard to believe this is my life now. Believe it. You earned every bit of it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Everett said, "I've been thinking about succession planning." "For when I retire?" Mason looked at him sharply. "You're not retiring. Not tomorrow. But in a few years, yes. And I want you to take over the foundation. Full leadership. Everett, you're ready, Mason, more than ready. You understand the work better than anyone." Everett smiled. "Besides, you've already transformed it into something beyond what I envisioned. It should be yours." Mason felt the weight and honor of the offer settle over him. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need. But my answer won't change." The celebration continued into the evening. Mason danced with Paula, laughed with Glenn, congratulated the newlyweds a dozen more times. And late in the night, as guests began leaving, he found himself alone with Drew once more. "Mom would have liked Bethany," Drew said quietly. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sheila since her death. Mason had told him about the final note, and Drew had cried, not for what was, but for what might have been. "Yeah," Mason agreed. "She would have. Do you think about her?" "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how we survived her leaving, how we found each other again." Mason put his arm around his son's shoulders. "How we built this." A week later, Mason closed on the small house where the wedding had been held. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a mortgage he could actually afford. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was his, truly, legally, permanently his. Drew and Bethany had found their own apartment across town, near the hospital, where Bethany had been accepted into a nursing program. Mason helped them move in, assembling furniture and offering unsolicited advice, until Drew kicked him out with affection. "We've got this, Dad. Go enjoy your empty nest." But the nest wasn't entirely empty. Mason filled it with purpose. He volunteered at Riverside Shelter every Saturday morning, mentoring men who were where he'd been a year ago. He shared his story, offered advice, connected people with resources. And sometimes he just sat and listened, because he remembered how much that had mattered. Bernard always greeted him warmly. "You're doing good work here, Mason, just paying it forward." At the foundation, the second housing complex opened to its first families. Mason stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony with Everett, watching 80 families receive keys to their new apartments. The joy on their faces reflected what he'd felt that first day in his own apartment: disbelief, relief, hope. The third complex had been approved, with construction starting in the spring. Mason was overseeing it all now, managing a team of 12, shaping programs, training new community liaisons in the methods he'd developed. And everywhere he looked, he saw the ripple effects of second chances. One afternoon, driving home from work, Mason saw a car pulled over with a flat tire. A young man stood beside it, looking frustrated and helpless in the fading light. Mason pulled over without thinking. "Need help?" he called. The young man looked up, surprised. Yeah, actually, I don't know how to change a tire." Mason smiled, popped his trunk and pulled out his jack. "Let me show you." As he knelt down to work, his knees protesting the cold pavement, Mason thought about that December night that had changed everything. About Everett's kindness, about cream-colored envelopes and black Rolls-Royces, and the improbable chain of events that had led him here. "I really appreciate this," the young man said, watching Mason work. "Happy to help." Mason tightened the last lug nut and stood. "What's your name?" "Chris." Mason pulled out his wallet and handed Chris his foundation business card. "If you ever need work or know someone who needs housing assistance, give me a call." Chris looked at the card, confused. "Why?" "Because someone helped me once when I needed it. Now I help others. That's how it works." He drove away as the young man stood there holding the card, and Mason wondered if this moment might change Chris's life the way a similar moment had changed his. That evening, Mason sat at his kitchen table in his own house, looking at the framed photograph of his father that now occupied the mantel. The phone rang, Drew calling to say goodnight, a habit they'd developed since he'd moved out. "Love you, Dad. Love you too, son." After hanging up, Mason walked through his quiet house, turning off lights, feeling the peace of it all. He'd traveled so far from the riverside shelter, from day labor and desperation, from the man who'd changed a tire in the snow simply because it was the right thing to do. He'd learned that second chances were real, that dignity mattered more than wealth, that kindness created ripples beyond imagination. He'd learned that falling didn't define you, getting back up did. And he'd learned that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built, one choice at a time, with people who saw you as you truly were and believed in who you might become. Mason turned off the last light and stood in the darkness, grateful for every hardship that had led him here, grateful for the man who'd stopped to see him as human rather than invisible, grateful for the life he'd rebuilt from nothing. Tomorrow he'd wake early, go to work, help more families find their way home. But tonight, he simply stood in his own home and let himself feel what he'd earned through perseverance and grace. Peace.